In one of the happiest days of his presidency, Richard Nixon saw his daughter Tricia marry Edward Cox on the White House lawn on June 12th of 1971. The next day, the wedding was front-page news, and so was the publication of the Pentagon Papers, government documents detailing the history of the American involvement in Vietnam in past administrations. The president was not particularly alarmed. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, was appalled.
The first reaction was, this can't hurt us because everything in the Pentagon Papers has to do with what happened before us. But then Kissinger said, but wait a minute. We're engaged in some rather delicate negotiations. And if it turns out that delicate diplomatic negotiations become public knowledge, it's going to hurt our ability to conduct our negotiations.
Richard Nixon's Justice Department attempted to get an injunction against the publication of any more of the papers in the New York Times, and in addition, the president responded with orders to stop any and all leaks cold. A White House special counsel, Charles Colson, was made head of a group called the Plumbers because stopping leaks would be their main task.
After you'd worked for Nixon for a while, you realized that he said things he didn't mean. So we sort of built in a delayed reaction to the most extreme things that he ordered us to do to make sure that he really wanted to do them and give him a chance to get off the hook. When Chuck Colson came along, he didn't operate that way. If Richard Nixon said, go blow up the Capitol, Colson would salute and run right out and buy a load of dynamite.
There probably were days when I pandered to Nixon's dark side. There may have been days, I would like to think, when I inspired his noble side. Did he have a dark side? Of course. So do you, so do I.
The first enemy Richard Nixon had taken on was the anti-war movement, which he felt was hamstringing his conduct of the Vietnam War.
Nixon used the apparatus, as we now know, of the government to discredit, use all of the intelligence gathering techniques against this anti-war movement. The embodiment of it was Daniel Ellsberg, who provided the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post.
As it would later be revealed, the Plumbers broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist to find damaging evidence against him. Meanwhile, the White House anger at the press just kept growing.
Nixon felt that the press was on the side of the anti-Vietnam people, so they started tapping the telephones of reporters. Absolutely outrageous. Can you imagine that coming out today?
But things were still relatively under control. That would end before long.
One afternoon, a man who had been assigned to my staff came eye-wide into my office and said, John, Chuck Colson wants me to firebomb the Brookings Institute. And I said, you've got to be kidding. And I said, what for? He said, well, there's some documents that they think are connected with the Pentagon Papers, and they want me to go in there, firebomb the place, and then make a burglary. I said, that's crazy. He said, I know it's crazy.
But even as the administration was going after its enemies, it was achieving its greatest successes. First, there was the remarkable visit to China, a nation Nixon had long painted as America's implacable foe. In February of 1972, Richard Nixon met with, drank with, and dined with the leaders of the world's most populous communist nation. He would later regard the trip as the high point of his presidency, and it was met with near universal acclaim. Then, in May of 1972, Richard Nixon went to the Soviet Union and signed a strategic arms limitation treaty, a first big step toward taming the arms race between the superpowers. It was part of a policy to warm relations with a land Nixon had always seen as profoundly evil. And with détente, a backing away from Cold War brinksmanship, the whole world breathed easier. In his policy toward the Soviets and China, Nixon gained two ends. On its own, the policy advanced Richard Nixon's goal of world peace, but it was also geopolitics at its most sophisticated. Fearful of each other, both Russia and China were more than ready to make America an ally.
I think that the opening of China and the establishment of détente with the Soviet Union was, first of all, an act of political courage on Nixon's part. It was very high-risk politics, and it was the product of very hard thinking on Nixon's part about the shape of the world and the shape of the United States and where we are in the world and what we need to do and what kind of world do we want 5 and 10 and 20 years from now.
It was Richard Nixon's past that made it all possible.
Only Nixon could have led to the relationship with China. That's because he was one of those who complained bitterly about who lost China, and he had the strong anti-communist reputation. So he was able to bring his constituency, which trusted him as they would nobody else, on the subject of China. You know, if Nixon says it's all right on this one, you know, it's got to be all right.
But as in so much of Richard Nixon's career, success was shadowed by failure, high purpose by low politics. On the very night he was toasting Leonid Brezhnev, 5,000 miles away, a small group of operatives were breaking into the Democratic headquarters in Washington. They'd get away with it this time, but a month later, it would be different.
The Democratic National Committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington. The 5 men carried cameras and apparently had planted electronic bugs. One of them had several crisp new $100 bills in his pocket. The Democrats say they have no idea who would want to spy on them.
June 17, 1972, the event that would begin what would forever after be known as Watergate took place when 5 men were arrested after breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. It wasn't long before the connection to at least somebody in the White House staff became apparent.
One of the things they seized when they arrested him was a telephone book which had the White House number and Chuck Colson's extension. I mean, that took 24 hours. It went to the White House overnight.
I willingly got involved in the cover-up, and as the weeks went by, I soon became, in essence, the desk officer of the cover-up. I was the man in the middle. I was, you know, going over to the re-election committee and finding out what they were doing and coming back and telling my superiors at the White House what they were doing and trying to make sure that nothing fell apart before the election.
Mr. Nixon, did you know about the burglary of our Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate? Did you know, Mr. Nixon?
But in the early days, the possibility that the president would one day be implicated in the affair was unimaginable.
Neither the president, obviously, or anybody in the White House, or anybody in authority in any of the committees working for the re-election of the president have any responsibility for it, and therefore there's no reason why it should be a matter of concern to the American public, and it certainly won't hurt the president's re-election.
As the 1972 election neared, Richard Nixon seemed to have it in a lock. Most Americans believed he was doing all he could to end the war in Vietnam as quickly and as responsibly as possible. The signing of the SALT agreement with the Soviets, détente, and the spectacular mission to China had won him enormous support, including grudging applause from his harshest critics. If Richard Nixon ran a subdued campaign in 1968, 1972 campaign, he was virtually invisible. His plan was to emerge from the White House only in the closing weeks. As it happened, the victory over liberal Senator George McGovern was nothing less than mammoth. It was unprecedented. Richard Nixon carried every single state in the Union save Massachusetts. But if he was overjoyed at his re-election, he didn't show it.
Nixon had the problem of being a sore winner. He had a lot to do in 1973. He won in a landslide, and now he was going to make some real changes.
Haldeman sent a bulletin around asking everybody for their resignation, the White House staff, as he wanted to clean house, but it wasn't done very beautifully. It was done rather harshly.
Throughout the first administration, the terrible story of Vietnam had continued. Hundreds of thousands of American troops had been withdrawn, but thousands of Americans continued to die there. At last, after so many false starts, the peace process succeeded. On January 27th of 1973, a ceasefire was signed at the peace talks in Paris. One of America's saddest episodes was over, and Richard Nixon's earlier pledge to end it had finally been redeemed.
It is necessary to recognize